All right, we're live. It's welcome to Misaligned. We're locked in as usual. We're locked on. You are locked in to another episode of your favorite podcast where we're going to have the conversations about things that you want to have the conversations about, but maybe you don't feel like you can have those conversations. So we're going to have them. You're joined by your hosts, Yemi, Cross, Farouk, and Jab at some point. And then when they do come in, we'll have that conversation with them as well and say, hang on, you need to be here when you're here, but it doesn't matter. We're going to just still crack on anyway as we are. Today's topic, we're going to be talking a little bit of an extension of two topics we've talked about in previous podcasts. We've talked a little bit about this when we were talking about democracy. We've talked a little bit about this in a few different other conversations, but I'm just going to hand this over to Yemi, our host and moderator, to just give us a bit of a thread and kick this off, and let's start having this conversation and this chat as we always do.
Great, thanks, Cross. Thanks everyone for joining us. Good to be back again. We are kicking it off today, straight up talking about Captain Traoré. I've been trying to practice the pronunciation of the name. I don't think I'm there yet, but I'm trying. The young, apparently charismatic, dynamic captain who's in charge of Burkina Faso, has been since 2022. And he's become, or at least he's becoming quite a popular figure in around Africa, certainly amongst young people. So I suppose we can dive straight into it, Cross. It's you and I on the show tonight. Is this rebellion or realignment? I suppose it depends on who you ask, but where do you stand on this?
I mean, I think I've got an interesting perspective about this one, because with Traoré and his new thing, I still don't know his name, but we'll figure it out. His thing seems to revolve around quite a lot of social media representation on how he looks versus what it is that he's implementing. He's still implementing quite a lot of very, very stringent and very strict changes off the back of what he's doing. But then I wonder about whether or not what he's doing is actually going to change or move the mark. 1 second, let me just pull this on there. It's not going, that's fine. Is it really realignment? I don't know. I think he's following the exact same things that most of these military governments or juntas have done. They come in, they take power, they focus on crushing the rebellion. They use propaganda to be able to establish whatever it is that they want. They push away the different mandates, like Traoré has done with the elections. They're supposed to have elections last year. He said, no more elections. All these elections are not interested. We're going to do them some other point. For whatever reason it is that he's saying, doesn't change what it is that always happens. We've seen this over the past 50 years. Multiple different systems have done this thing. So I see it as a rebellion, kind of, but I see it more as more of the same. We have people coming in because they have an interest in power. He wants power. He's taking power, and he knows how to use social media as well. So when he goes on social media with his nice fancy gloves and everything, it looks great. It's fantastic. It's great for the eyes. But at the end of the day, what is actually changing? Nothing. It's the exact same thing. People come in, take power, use military authority, etc., establish themselves and take control of everything that there is to take control of. That's what I'm seeing.
Fascinating. And I, in some sense, I share your view on that. I think where this becomes particularly difficult for me is that on the one hand, I see everything you're saying. I mean, we've been down this road before. This is not the first time a military ruler comes, takes power, and rides the wave of populism that goes around that. I mean, we've seen this in Nigeria, even in the past, where military comes in, takes power, and people are actually celebrating on the streets because they believe that there will be positive change and and the military takes power to kind of undo some of the difficulties in the past. So that's one aspect to it. On the other hand, he has actually taken some steps that seem to me to suggest that he knows what he's doing to an extent, and that he cares for the people. Whether or not that will bear fruit, for me, is always a retrospective analysis. So I can't tell you going forward. I can only tell you 5 years down the line. What I see, though, is a young man who appears to be able to play both sides of the game very well, which you might argue, fair enough, if you could do that. On the one hand, he's doing exactly what you're saying, which is playing the populism game, but also appears to be trying his best to recognize that there are systemic and structural difficulties in the country. For example, the difficult relationship with Western powers and local corruption, and is actually taking some steps to address those. So in a sense, I'm conflicted and maybe even sitting on the fence on this one. I think the end will justify the means, possibly, or is just going to unravel. But I think a lot of the popularity and a lot of the accolades that he's getting seems to be disproportionate. I think people are just being, in a sense, they're being sold a propaganda. And actually, even lots of the claims of some of the things he's done, they're just outright falsehood. And it seems that all common sense has gone out through the window, and any attempt to inject common sense into that conversation just gets painted as, oh, you're jealous of this young guy who is doing amazing for Burkina Faso and everything will be great. And I think so that there's a bit of naivety on the part of some of the supporters. But yeah, I am kind of sitting on the fence on this. In one hand, I agree with everything you've said, but on the other hand, I can see some positivity there.
But and listen, I think this is one of those interesting ones as well. If you take a step back and you say, okay, well, what exactly is he trying to achieve? If you look at the rationale that they've said, obviously there's the official rationale, right, about trying to restore, power to the to the country, the gold thing that they're trying to do. So for those who don't know, that really trying to focus on the gold industry by curtailing private gold organizations and turning it into a thing, which is something that we can talk about from a Nigerian perspective, because Nigeria should not be exporting petrol, in my view. I mean, that's my personal perception. We should not be exporting at the volumes that we are exporting them at. But what is he doing that is any different from anybody else that has been there and done the same thing? I don't really see that. And I think I'm taking that step to go back, and we're probably going to move into this at other sections of this conversation as well. Well, forget him. Traoré. Forget him. He's making a change, and he's doing it in a slightly different way. He is essentially a coup. He's a president via junta. He's a president, a head of state who's taking power by force. Okay. What he's doing is not any different from what anybody else has done. What he's trying to achieve is not different from anybody else has done. It's the same thing. Everyone comes in. And then I start wondering in my mind at the end of the day, that does any of this kind of system, when we're talking about it from democracy, which leads to these systems of militaristic coups and overriding power, etc., does it work? We don't have coups in Europe. We've not had any coups in Europe in, someone correct me if I'm wrong, anywhere, if you got comments, etc. I don't think we've had any coups in the past 200 years in Europe. Why do we keep having coups in Nigeria and in Africa? Why? There's something happening.
Weak institutions, isn't it? So and that's the argument that people make against this sort of interventions, as I suppose you're alluding to. So at the end of the day, we're not going to be saved by a person, right? If you want to frame all of this in a sort of savior context, which I don't particularly like anyway, but we're not going to be saved by any one person. Our redemption, or whatever you call it, will be uh, through institutions. Okay, so I suppose your despair is coming from the standpoint that, yeah, soldier go, soldier come,
Mm-hmm.
nothing changes because, and again, I share that. So Captain Traoré is not going to save Burkina Faso, and it's not going to save Africa. But on the other hand, I don't think that means that nothing good can come out of this. I think, but I don't feel as confident as these people who are all over social media thinking they're damn sure that salvation's here. I certainly am not in that camp, because what I see is all of the problems that you've highlighted, which is, why do we keep going around in circles and always thinking that we've got a savior? I can see that clearly, and that seems to be a problem. But at the same time, you do get the odd, not all the motions are exactly the same. Okay, so we've had some military leaders who've done better than others. Thomas Sankara comes to mind, and it seems to me that Captain Traoré may be one of those that is more towards the exceptional side of the spectrum. But only time will tell. I think he's made some moves to nationalize key industries, curb corruption, and improve wages and entitlement of public servants. But I also worry that the very fierce anti-Western rhetoric becomes in itself a radicalizing ground and a distraction. Okay, I think often when we focus on a problem, one of the big problems, as if that's all that matters, and if you deal with that, then everything becomes nice and dandy. What it does actually is that it becomes a breeding ground for radicalization. By radicalization, I don't mean people necessarily taking up bombs and doing things. I just mean people having this sort of to the extreme of the spectrum thinking. France is responsible for all of our problems, and once we get rid of France, everything will be nice and dandy. I don't share that view. I agree that the relationship between the West and African countries has often been dysfunctional to the benefit of the West. I think that's almost indisputable. But I don't think in itself that all of our problems is innately in that relationship, and that once you get rid of them, you're fine. In any case, you're not going to be able to get rid of them. The world is becoming more and more intermingled, if you like. We're all, there's the internet, there's global travel all the time. So you're not really technically going to get rid of anyone. Ask the members of the British public, some of whom are trying to get rid of migrants and refugees, and how hard it is. Like, you're not going to be able to do it. Like, the world has become so, everyone's into each other's business these days. So this is what I worry about. But having said that, I think of the military leaders who took over recently. So you're talking about Niger, Burkina Faso, and I believe Senegal. Captain Ibrahim Traoré appears to be probably a bit more standout, and so in terms of the actions he's taking, and even the economic outlook for Burkina Faso, the projections seem to be favorable. They're not excellent, but they are favorable. So, and I think that's down to some of the steps that he's taken.
I mean, first of all, shout out to QB Finest coming in again, with the comment. Hope you guys are keeping cool. It's a bit hot, struggling. I'm definitely struggling. That's why.
That's a good question.
Yeah, but we did. We full ground. We're taking what we can. I think if we take a step back to think a little bit about why these things happen, my view is quite strong about the importance of understanding the right economic and social political systems for different cultures. I don't think that democracy, and I've said this before, but I'm saying it again, I don't think democracy works for everyone. It works for Europe. That's fantastic for Europe. Why are we doing it in Africa? Why are we doing it in Southeast Asia? Why are we trying to implement this in all the other parts of the world? Why do we think that democracy is something that everybody should have? This is my question, personally, because Traoré is a good example of how people react and respond to systems that are enforced on them. The system that was enforced on them was democracy. And in 2020, I think, was it 2020 or 2022? I'm going to have to just plead some apologies here. But there was essentially a push. We've had two different coups occur in that country. In both cases, where there was a focus on getting people. Are you?
Sorry, can you hear me still?
Yep, I can hear you now.
Yeah. Sorry, what I've just done is changed my device because I think I was struggling with the internet slightly there. But I expect this to be better.
Here is here. I mean, it's one of those things because I'm thinking while I'm speaking, so I'm trying to put my thoughts together while I'm speaking. But I've been wondering whether or not this is one of those things where it's like it is not. We keep trying to force the same shoe, the same foot into the same shoe. This shoe doesn't fit, but we keep trying to. You need to have this shoe. You need to have this shoe. And this shoe is called democracy. This foot must fit. And we're looking at this shoe, and the foot is not fitting. So why do we keep trying to make it work? Why don't we look for the right shoe to fit the foot that we have? I think this is my biggest thing. I think in terms of the segment, topic or the conversation at this point around this rebellion or realignment, what I see is a reaction to a misalignment between the current democratic system and the people that are there. That's what I see. I'm not seeing anything else beyond that. That's all I see.
And I think we've had this conversation in the past. And you're kind of alluding to again our second segment, but also referencing a conversation we've had in the past, whether democracy is imported or inherited, or what does it mean to Africans? And I suppose your view about that appears to be clearer and clearer to me by the day, which is that democracy doesn't seem to be African, and it doesn't seem to be working for Africa.
Yep.
But I would kind of challenge you slightly on that. Is it democracy that's the problem, or is it a copy and paste attitude to democracy in the way that we kind of operationalize it that might be the problem? Because as far as I am concerned, democracy doesn't necessarily mean what the West does. It means, as the dictionary states, and again, we got hung up on this the other day with Jab. I think the most common definition that's given is government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And by that, you're talking about participation, right? So you are saying that a democracy is a form of government where, welcome, Farouk. Better late than never. We're glad to have you. So we'll just
I'm pleased to be here as well. Just jumping into the definition of democracy, the famous old cliche. Carry on, I'm listening. But
that's correct.
I hope you won't fall into my misalignment on that definition.
No, so we'll come to that in a second. But if someone can please keep an eye on the chat, because I'm on a mobile device today.
Fine. I've got eyes
on it. It's hard
for
me to keep an eye on the chats. Because we had this conversation in the other day, and Farouk wasn't here. I believe he was Cross, I, and Jab, where we got into the definition of democracy, and I think I and Cross were kind of aligned on a sort of straightforward definition that's quite commonly accepted and understood as democracy being the government of the people, for the people, and by the people. Anyhow you want to understand that. But Jab was of a slightly different view. He said democracy is a government that works, right? And we said, no, no, no. So inherent, in the definition of a car, doesn't matter whether it works or not. If it's a car, it's a car, right? If it's got the engine and the steering wheel doesn't matter if it's malfunctional, it's still a car. And so we kind of got stuck there. But I think what Cross is saying today is that he doesn't believe democracy is for us in Africa. And I think but by that you mean the Western operation of democracy. So you're talking about going to elections every 4 years or 6 years and having a couple of parties campaigning, talking to people, and one man, one vote. It doesn't matter whether you are an alcoholic who is in rehab or you're a university professor, one man, one vote. And I suspect that that's what you're saying at this time doesn't work for Africans. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, so what I'm saying is the entire concept itself doesn't work. So democracy is one of those concepts that, depending on how you look at it, or the generally accepted concept of democracy focuses on one vote for everybody who's eligible by some criteria that's been predefined by everybody, can determine the leadership of the of the nation. Now, in most countries, that predetermination tends to focus on things like age, focus on things like it's age primarily, to be honest, if we want to be very specific about it. And in my view, I think that doesn't work. I think when we look at things like, for example, people voting based on age is silly. I don't think people should vote because they're a certain age. And we see the evidence of this in Africa. We had this conversation before, but I think the European standards and the Western standards have created a system on infrastructure that allows them to be able to accommodate people who vote that are below the ages that they should be voting at, and not making a sizable impact. In some cases, making a sizable impact, but in general, not making enough of a sizable impact that it affects general voting patterns. We've got lots of situations that we have. We can just look at Britain, look at America at the moment, and we can look at the past 10 years. From Brexit to today, we've had people that have been voted into power that we should be questioning whether we're already crazy or not crazy. Do you know what I mean?
But that's from your own point of view. So again, if I'm thinking, if what you're thinking is what I'm thinking, you're talking about people who 50% of the population of the voting population who came out to vote sometimes voted for. So if you're questioning the mentality or the rationality of 50% of the population, I would have to say you've got to question your own rationality.
No, but it depends on the question is my issue. And this is my problem with democracy, is that what is the question? So the question is, in 2016, the question that was put to the British people was, should the UK exit the European Union? That question in itself didn't cover any of the things that people were actually interested in. So you had a whole bunch of different people with different reasons, voting for different things, for different outcomes that they're all chasing.
Yes. So if I may jump in at this point, if I may jump in here, I mean, I missed the first 18 minutes of the conversation, so I don't know what's been said. So to our viewers and the other panelists, forgive me, repetitive. But looking at today's topic, is democracy really working for Africa? Or are we clinging to a broken model? Is democracy really working for Africa? The answer is no. Are we clinging to a broken model? We are a broken people, organized in broken systems and rebuilding. So that's my simple answer to today's topics. But to the wider question of democracy, and just like Yemi hinted on, when we talk about democracy, I am specifically referring to the most discussed, defined, and operationalized model, the Western model. When I look at that idea of government of the people, for the people, by the people, to my understanding, it by no means multi-party democracy where people go and vote. That's not my understanding of it. I would want to see. I understand it as a spectrum where that model, where the 2-party, 3-party, 1-party, several party, people vote, one man, one vote, rules of the game, and people vote. That's one iteration of it. I think in many African cultures, outside of the systems that were imposed on our geopolitical constructs and nations, we practice various systems that can be defined or understood as government of the people, for the people, by the people, where various segments of society, women, elders, hunters, market people, young people, warriors, had a say in how governance, administration, and matters of the state were run. I would argue that those are forms of democracy. I would argue those are forms of democracy. Not necessarily Western multi-party or electoral systems, but forms of governance that meets the definition I logged in hearing Yemi define. And so that's the other point I wanted to throw in there. And I guess a crucial question that then comes up that directly therefore addresses the question is that I hands up, so I lied when I answered the first question by saying, is democracy working for Africa? Well, the answer is no. But then when I think of that question in the context of what are the alternatives, should some superstar grab the gun and take over power? Or should we have the multi-party broken system we have where we are wobbling through and learning through? Or should we accept a pragmatic evolution of our own forms of democracy? My argument, when I think of the options, when I think of it in terms of the alternatives available, is that however flawed democracy is, it appears, in my view, to be the best. That allows broad-based participation, that allows correction, and that allows evolution. So that's where I'll stop for now.
Fascinating. I think what I've heard you do there is, which I kind of like, is almost reclaim the definition of democracy from a Western understanding of it, where you've got a couple of parties and you're doing cycles of election, to the part of what the definition is participation. So this is a government that represents, that includes. Okay, and to me, that's what democracy is. And so, to my mind, I don't think we need to be asking the question about whether democracy has worked or not. The reason I say that is, if you think about the forms of governance that are available, that you can choose from, just in a theoretical sense, it's hard to sell anything better than the definition of democracy. Again, I am not defining it necessarily by the Western have an election every 4 years. I am saying a government that represents the people, that includes broad participation by the people. Again, I don't see how you can sell anything that's better than that. I suppose the question then becomes, how do we take that ideal concept and turn it into a sort of customized version for Africans? I am not sure I know what the answer is. So I'm going to maybe put this out to say, why don't you factor that into your contributions as we talk about, again, democracy? How many African countries have truly benefited from democratic elections in the last 30 years or democratic processes? Can you think about any? And forms of democracy, I think, again, I've just kind of touched on that very briefly, but I'm happy for Cross or Farouk to take that on.
I mean, I think we've got a bit of a challenge here where we think about democracy and then we're thinking about we're looking at very specific outcomes without or very specific elements without thinking about the outcomes of those elements. So for example, we talk about participation. Okay, so we got 100% of people in a country participating in a thing. Is that good? We've not thought about that. So we're saying, well, democracy requires people of the people, for the people, by the people, etc., all that kind of stuff. Like, that's fantastic. But is it good that we have all people voting or making decisions? Or should we focus on the people who are capable of making those decisions?
It depends on what the decision is.
I know, exactly. That's exactly my point. And the second thing is about representation. We say, okay, representation is something that's a factor that we should be really caring about. It's like, well, should we really care about representation? So, for example, we don't have representation for babies.
What does that mean?
Yeah. So whenever we're having voting, etc., and stuff like that, we're not saying, okay, well, we need to have a proportional representation of babies during these elections.
Their parents represent them.
Okay, but again, but no, that sounds great because you're creating a representation, but they're not actually being represented by themselves. They should be represented because we're going back to participation as well.
No, they are represented. So when you talk about representation, you're not. In fact, that's exactly what it means. You don't require the participation of every single person. You require a participation that's even. Okay, so that's what you call representation. So when you go to the House of Reps and we carve out the country into a number of units, and we say one person from each of these units come to the House of Reps, that's exactly what representation means. It doesn't mean that anyone from my family or your family has to be there. Okay, yep. But so the unit of representation is in fact defined again in a sort of customized sense. So the democracy has to define what the units are and how the representation comes about by that. For example, when we talk about federal ministers being appointed from each state, again, that is representation. They don't have to come from my village. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
it does. It does. I think you both raise very important points, and I want to speak to them. The first point is about this idea of governance and democracy. Yemi and Cross. I believe, and it is my observation, when I have looked at history, which is one of my favorite pastimes, that the way a people govern themselves is evolved. It's adapted and it changes. This is the case even in the so-called Western democracies, and it is the case in Africa. So when we ask the question, is democracy working? I think part of the point here is, as Yemi said, we need to first recognize that whatever will work for us has to be evolved by us. Whatever we copy and paste will necessarily be bastardized by our values, our priorities, our realities, our tensions, our disagreements, our various priorities and values. So whereas you can go and copy the American Constitution, copy the presidential system of government, and say, oh, it's Nigeria. But Nigerians value tribe, they value religion, they value different things. And as we wobble and evolve that system, we have to bastardize what we've copied. And I think part of our feeling that democracy is not working, part of our feeling and what's evident that it's corrupted, it's bastardized, is that process of evolution. A child will stand, crawl, try to walk, stumble a few times, and then over time, perhaps each generation by generation, each generation will choose a settlement that works for them. Think about Nigeria at independence. Parliamentary system, regional government. That generation of Nigerians within 6 years were killing each other in a civil war. Then there was another settlement. And then in 79, there was another settlement, several coups. And then since 1999, there's been another settlement. And now with the Fulani herdsmen issue in the Middle Belt, it is obvious to me that we need another settlement. And that will be the case for all of time. And if we were to claim the definition of democracy, it would therefore be how the various identities within this geopolitical construction called Nigeria seek representation, seek governance, share power, and agree to coexist. In a sense, whether we call the person an Oba, an emir, or whatever, as long as everyone is participating in whatever group, state, local government, tribe, in my view, that must be what we call our democracy. The Americans went through the same. The English, the Europeans went through the same. And it's that evolution. And what we're seeing is early days, it's failings, it's failure, it's stumbles. But we must not, and we cannot, and we will not achieve or be able to copy and paste what others are doing. Anybody that attempts to do that will then have to undertake a cultural revolution that kills half of the population. Yeah, because they understand how it should be a different way.
But what you're advocating is very similar to copy-paste anyway. You're saying copy-paste, but copy-paste what we like.
No. What I'm saying is that the circumstance of our existence meant that certain systems were imposed on us. So we didn't copy. They were imposed. Our boundaries, our name, the people in Nigeria was imposed on us by far powerful forces. So that's the starting point. What we must then do as Yemi, Cross, and Farouk, just as I do with my partner and my wife at home, is then learn and evolve the way we can coexist, avoid conflict, and develop together. And I'm arguing that every generation of Nigeria will have issues that they need to deal with. And I think the issue for today is insecurity, fueled partly by our huge nomadic population. The largest nomadic population in the world are the Fulani people with their cattle. And we're a farming people. So that tension, we need to find a way. Today, I've just come across very exciting news about a huge farming group in the Southwest and Meeti Allah having a meeting and signing a communique and then forwarding that to the presidency. That's democracy. That's solving tension. That's representation. And we will continue to model things until we get something we can then pass on to future Nigerians that hopefully we keep improving and solving each tension for each generation. Or like South Sudan, we fight and split. And even the constituent parts, we still have to. Because think about it at the most basic unit of society, which is the family. This is my last point. We have these conversations with our wives. We have to agree representation. We have to agree resource sharing. We have to agree values, governance, systems at home. It's the same for businesses. It's the same for communities. It's the same for villages. It's the same for the country. And we have to start believing that it is democracy. It is democracy because as long as people are involved and they participate, that's the definition of democracy. You mustn't. I don't have political parties in my home. Somehow we make decisions, and somehow everybody is involved, including the kids. But as a nation, we have to encode it in law, in the constitution, and then move on. Thank you.
Cross, do you disagree with any of that?
Before I do that, I should probably just read the chats have come in. So we had OB Finest, QB Finest. Yeah, shout out QB Finest, always consistent with the contributions. Democracy is not working based on the definition. I agree with you on this one. The government are only pursuing their own personal interests. They are not servants of the people, working tirelessly to deliver on promises made. They are not making the roads safer, providing good education, health, electricity, and institutional support for the welfare of the people. And this ties into my rejoinder as well to
Can I
your
just say
point.
something about Obi Fine's point
Mhm.
on delivery? Obi, thanks for your engagement and thanks for that point. But that
GB.
is a different question. It is a question of what makes something legitimate. So Al Maktoum, the Al Maktoum family, the Bin Saud family, the Al Maktoum family in UAE, the Bin Saud family in Saudi Arabia are not democracies. They are monarchs, but they've demonstrated competence. And competency is certainly something that brings about legitimacy.
Mm.
If Mr. Traoré in Burkina Faso, for example, has come to power by the gun, I am saying that I don't like that. But I will be the first to say, if he demonstrates competence, to say, well, he is competent. Just like I would say the leaders of UAE have shown competency by bringing wealth and development to the people. That's a different argument. The ruling party by the famous Singaporean was Lee Kuan Yew. It was democracy, but they showed competence and they developed the country. The Chinese Communist Party is a one-party state, and they've manifested in the last 40 years the greatest miracle in terms of people lifted out of poverty and development in human history. So that point is about competence, not about democracy, because there are examples from across the spectrum of dictators, the chap in Rwanda, military dictators that have been competent, of monarchs that have been competent, and of democracies that have delivered on good governance. So that's a different argument, but I do agree with him. And that's why I agree also that democracy has failed Nigeria because it has not developed competence. Our people, not just Nigeria, Africa, our people generally have not bought into it. And I think there are reasons for that. We didn't evolve the system. So we necessarily have to first bastardize it. It's not our system. The systems are generations. And I will argue that most of these systems would meet the definition of democracy. Systems that generations of our ancestors honed, perfected, learned, warbled, and passed on was truncated by colonialists. Completely. The chief priest, the upper court system. I have argued before, and I think you all agreed with me, that in my readings, the Benin Empire, for example, of old, was better managed, better governed, and better administered than current day Nigeria. It is also my observation, and again from my reading, that the Ottoman Danfodio Empire, with the resources and technologies they had there, in terms of competence, was better managed than the current day Nigeria, in my view. And I think that's because these are systems we evolved, learned, and passed on. Now we've been long together and a new system has been imposed. We necessarily have to go through this process of bastardizing it. But yes, to agree with you, Obi Finest, it's not working, but that's a matter of competence. It's not a matter of democracy.
I disagree with you about that one a little bit. I think the examples that you've given have been in spite of democracy rather than as a result of democracy, or in tandem with. I think democracy in itself is an expression of capitalism. So I want to take a step back. Democracy as a concept is a sociocultural one. It's not necessarily an economic concept. So we need to be very careful about this because it's very easy to merge these things and assume that economies can become successful as a result of the political concepts or constructs that are applied to them. That's not the case. China is not the most capitalistic democratic economic system. Doing pretty well though. One of the richest in the world at the moment, right? The BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China. What's the S? I can't remember what the S stands for. But
South Africa.
South Africa. They're all very fast growing. the levels of implementation of democracy are completely varied, but they're doing very damn well in terms of how they are looking economically. My issue, I'm going back to it, is about democracy in itself. Does democracy support these success stories that we talk about? I don't think so. I don't see any evidence for it. I don't think economic. I don't think.
Can I give you something to think about?
Go for it.
India in the last 10 years. Today, India has the fastest growing economy of all the major economies, or well over 5%. I can't remember the exact figure. It is estimated in another 10, 15 years, it will double its GDP. They've had a stunning 10 years. 10 years ago, the GDP of India and the GDP of Nigeria, of Africa, were similar, about similar 10 years ago. In the last 10 years, that of Africa has stagnated and that of India has doubled. India is the largest economy in the world. I think in the last 10 years, they've done something right. But it is a democracy. That's one example.
Second largest. No, it doesn't work because they're the second largest population in the world.
They've lifted so many people out of poverty.
They have a lot of people. They have the second largest population in the world. They have a lot of people. Of course, they're going to be very successful when they're dealing with economies of scale, which is one of the biggest things that we're doing now in the world of consumerism. If you look at what's been happening with things like mobile phones, computers, etc., we've been producing these things significantly faster. When it comes with things like software, AI is the new thing that's been happening lately. We've required lots of hands-on, cheap labor to be able to deliver value very, very quickly. Where are the countries that this comes from? The BRICS. If you look at them, it's the BRICS. It's the BRICS countries, and has nothing to do with democracy or the actual system of political power. What it has to do with is the number of people that are there to deliver value cheaply.
But you still need functioning systems to do that.
Do you really need functional systems to do that? I disagree. I'm not necessarily sure that you necessarily need functional systems. And even if you needed functional systems, you don't necessarily require democracy. You could have functional systems that were juntas. If we're going back to the conversations that we had earlier about Burkina Faso as an example, where there's been military, coup there over the past 4 years, and there's been concepts and questions about transitioning into more democratic or more civilian sorts of regimes, etc. It doesn't change what happens and what makes a difference in a country.
No, it doesn't. And I'm not arguing that you need.
Yeah, I'd like to refocus our minds on something. I mean, it's a framework I often use when I suspect I'm getting waylaid. Yeah? Or when I suspect I'm getting waylaid. What are the alternatives? If we think democracy has not worked for Africa, it's not like Africa has not had its fair share of military dictatorships. None have produced different outcomes. So let's keep this conversation theoretical, because we have manifests. I mean, Nigeria was under military rule for most of the 90s, 80s and 90s.
So 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s.
Military rulers of all types. So we've had those like who were in bed in the West. We've had those like Abacha who was anti-West.
Yes.
Same outcomes.
Yes. So, and that's why I thought I needed to bring that here to help us focus. There's a theoretical or conceptual conversation about democracy, what it is, and how we need to take back the definition. I would argue that that's different from competence.
They are different. And
yes.
You could have a competent anything. And you could have
we can have a competent king, like the Emiratis do, the Qataris do, or the Saudis do. You can have a competent dictator like the kings in Europe of old did, and they build wealth. You can have a competent one-party system like the Chinese do, or a competent political party within a multi-party system like in Singapore or maybe in most of Europe. So let's not let's not get waylaid by interpreting the fact that democracy appears to have failed in Africa or appears to be failing in Africa and think that defines competence. Because these same leaders, give them military gear, they will still fail.
So let me, there's a way to frame the question that might then capture that and stop us from falling into that hole. Democracy better, any form of it at all, at promoting competence than dictatorship.
Exactly.
So again, this is a comparative. Exactly. Is it better? And if not, why is democracy any better at all? So
the answer is no. The answer is no. That's the answer. The answer is no.
Yeah,
democracy.
Explain your answer then.
Yeah, because of course, democracy has not shown any proof or any evidence of it being better at promoting competency. In fact, more than anything, we've seen incompetency. As an economist myself, and some people who know me, and we have this very similar backgrounds as well. Economics, one of the biggest issues with democracy as it stands, it's that it's a system of popularism rather than competency. And we've ended up in situations that are completely economically daft. Like I said, I talked about Brexit in the past. I mean, I feel sorry for those people who are big fans of him. But I think Trump is a good example where if I was American, if you listen to this and you think I'm leftist, I'm not. I would have voted Trump because I had two options of these two different people between Kamala and Trump. I was going to vote Trump. I had no option. But that doesn't mean that these were the best options that were burbled up to the surface. This is the reality.
Does autocracy promote
Cross? Let's come with me. Let's do this conceptual experiment.
Yep.
To try and answer Yemi's question.
Mm-hmm.
You have a completely incompetent autocrat or king in country A. He makes all the decisions. Perhaps he feels he's the most competent person.
Mm-hmm.
There is no participation, there's no involvement at all.
Mm-hmm.
And in country B, you have a completely incompetent democratic leader of any form of democracy, including the iterations we describe as African, where the Council of Elders can come together and have an influence and participate, where the War Council, the chiefs, the advisors, the women, the traders, the parliament, the judiciary have a say. And you set these two systems up for all of time. Which one do you think over time might evolve to encourage competence? This is the starting position is a very incompetent king or dictator.
Yep.
In that kind of system, and a very incompetent president or leader or prime minister in a democratic system. Given what you know, which do you think over time might stumble on something on processes that might keep improving themselves?
I think what you're doing here is what I call the false equivalence. You're looking at two extreme scenarios and assuming that those are the only options. I don't think
but that's a question. But that's a question. Yeah,
but why is that the question?
Which is more likely to breed competence?
Yeah, but why are we comparing these two? We can compare additional
because we're looking at what breeds competence.
Yeah, but
the question is about we're asking about systems here. So yeah. I have a company where I make all decisions. I don't listen to anyone. There's a company where there's a board, advisors, division of labor, perspectives. There's more participation. I'm not even talking about people being able to vote. There's more participation, which means my views and my judgments are not supreme.
Okay.
Which is more likely to bring better outcomes over time.
But again, you're
creating a false... I think what you're thinking about, which a lot of right-wing commentators speak about, is a weakness of democracy, whereby if you have a competent leader but it's a competent dictator. The dictatorship tends to do things faster. And when most of the West looks at China and decision making and the streamlined bureaucracy, you look at Dubai, look at Saudi Arabia, where there is competence and then decision making is quicker because there's less participation. If we flip it that way, many people will feel dictatorship is better. Yeah, do you get what I'm doing?
But why are you focusing on only those options? And this is probably to the third part of the conversation.
I welcome you to bring more options, but let's answer the question first. Then we can consider other options.
But to answer the question, I need to bring a new option. Is what it is, because it's like.
Let's hear the other.
Sorry?
Tell us the other options then.
So what we're saying right now is that we've got two options. We're stuck between democracy with an incompetent person or autocracy with someone who's very, very, autocratic, etc. It's like, well, what about a system where we focus on meritocracy? What about a system where the most competent person leads the most competent position and role?
Meritocracy can exist within any system.
Doesn't exist in
a democracy. It can do.
Nope.
It's about processes.
Nope. It can't. It can't. Because democracy requires people who are not able to make decisions to make decisions. This is the first thing that we talked about 18-year-olds being able to vote, about specific kinds of people being able to make decisions and vote that should not be able to make decisions.
I think part of what you're picking out across is that democracy allows people to vote usually on an already streamlined choice. So if you look at the list of prime ministers in the UK from inception, about, again, don't quote me on the stats, but I think I'll be close to correct, if not correct. Over 70% of them or something like that have been graduates of Oxbridge.
Yeah, exactly. It's something like Oxbridge or what's the other one? I forget the other one. There's two of Eton or Oxbridge.
Yeah. So there's a streamlined option, and that's part of actually what people criticize democracy for. That is, in sense,
but again, but then, for just so our viewers know, without taking this deep dive into the details of Western democracy, we tend to think our own systems of democracy are inferior to it. When you take the deep dive into any system, you begin to understand that the options are actually compartmentalized and narrowed, either covertly, overtly, implicitly, explicitly. The idea that anybody can be anything is probably more so in Nigeria than it is in the West.
Absolutely. So a random person is more likely.
We're not changing
than UK.
I was discussing with a friend yesterday. Sorry to bring this gist. I was discussing with a friend yesterday, and we're reflecting on medical doctor colleagues who accept their fate. So from the day they graduate, or from the day they were born, really, they know they are middle class. They will remain middle class until the end of their lives. And I was reflecting and telling him that Nigerians don't think that way.
Well, he's a doctor and he's middle class.
Yeah. I say Nigerians don't necessarily think that we aspire to classes because it is still a country.
Wait, I'm sorry. He's a doctor, is middle class? How is that possible?
No, sorry, I'm talking about working class. I'm talking about the class system in this country and how people have accepted that generations of them will remain there.
Okay, yeah, fair enough.
And I was now reflecting on the fact that there is some kid now in Ajegunle that can become the Nigerian president.
True. Well,
it is so remarkable that when you think about people like Obasanjo, Tinubu,
I mean, good luck, Jonathan, though.
Good luck. No, even Obasanjo.
He had no slippers. Good luck, Jonathan.
No, even people like Obasanjo, Tinubu, good luck. You don't know their Abdul Salami. You don't know their families. They are not from renowned families. They are not from.
Good luck, Jonathan had no slippers. He had no shoes. He was elected because he had no shoes. It was a regular.
Well, that's not the point. I guess the point I'm trying to make is that in terms of social, in terms of fixed classes, this is beside the point, but it's just an interesting point. In terms of fixed classes, there is still more opportunity and social mobility in Nigeria, in my observation, than in most of these in most of these countries that have systems and classes.
It's not true.
Yeah, maybe you can make the point better if you understand what I'm trying to say.
I know what you're saying. I know what you're saying in terms of class to a degree. But I think I mean, we're moving to another conversation.
Yes,
but I can wrap
absolutely.
it back to the same conversation at the same time, and still say one of the things about this is that one of the issues that we tend to have is that in Nigeria, class differentiation is it's in smaller buckets. So in Nigeria, the difference in your class is in in our class. It is in much smaller groups. So it's in okay, you're earning, I don't know. I don't know the numbers anymore because the numbers don't make any sense to me. When I've looked at numbers, I'm like, I don't understand this pound naira currency. It doesn't make sense. Anyway, but those buckets are a bit different. In England, you tend to have three: you're low, you're middle, you're high. Period. That's it. There's nothing else. But in Nigeria, there's levels. There's this one as this is the guy where they go jail for club, etc. Those kind of things. And then there's the things in the middle at the bottom. This is the driver. This is the one that's the professional accountant, etc. We have levels of these structures, which is different. You can't compare them directly to England. A doctor in England, you cannot compare them to anybody else in Nigeria in terms of the income, etc. There's no
one of the things
direct comparison.
So one of the things about class in the UK certainly is that it's not just about money. So there are quite a few factors that go into, and what you'd find is that in the professional ranks, so you're talking lawyers, doctors, most of them tend to be middle class. Okay, and the reason they're middle class is not because they are lawyers or doctors. They'll be middle class if they were anything else. It's their family background that makes them middle class. So often whatever profession they end up in, they will still be middle class.
No, they can escape that though. I mean, they can escape that.
So anybody escapes anything. I suppose the point Farouk's making is the probability that you will. So what you find is that class system in the UK is way more stable than in Nigeria. It's way more stable. So these kids that are born in the rough parts of Scunthorpe, the majority of them will remain lower class. The majority of their children will remain lower class. This is how it is.
Generations.
It's just who they are. That is them. Period. Yeah, agreed.
So and that's one big difference in terms of participation. I think it speaks to exactly what we're saying about participation, that the Western democracy tends to be, if you pay attention to the kind of fine workings of the democracy, it is not as participatory as it looks on the surface, because what people are getting to vote on is choices that have already been made at multiple levels before it gets presented to them. So this is almost like what you do with a child at home. Do you want a sweet corn or strawberries? I've already made the choice of what's on the menu before presenting it to you.
Right?
And in a sense, you think that you are the one making the choice. No, there's a limited and this is what happens in Western democracy. So you've got the corporate organizations, you've got the donors, you've got the political establishments, you've got foreign influence. They've all kind of whittled down the choices to, Keir Starmer versus who was running against Rishi Sunak, and that's that. One of them will be prime minister. It doesn't matter.
You can't plug a cross and say because everybody votes cross, come and be president. No, doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
I think we need to go. We need to go to that. I mean, I think we're probably crossing over into no.
And then when you reflect on that, deep dive into Western democracy, then there's really no difference between APC saying we have a consensus candidate we present to you.
But again, it's because
PDP saying we need to then recognize that this is an adaptation based on our own values, and then just make it resilient.
It doesn't work. You can't make it. We can't. And this is probably because I imagine we're probably thinking, on you, but imagine you're probably thinking about closing thoughts. But this is the biggest issue that I've got, is that we keep trying to tweak democracy rather than stopping to say, does it work or should we do something else? What are the alternatives?
What do you propose
to do this?
So that's the last topic. Why don't you just
what do you propose we do?
Jump straight into it. What's the future? What is better than democracy? What should we be doing?
Meritocracy. We need to have a system where there's multiple different votes based on capabilities. We need to have people who are in positions of power.
Operationalize it for me, please. Tell me how it's going to happen.
I'm about to do that. So we need to have people in positions of authority based on the competence. The best person who is able to create laws based on their own peers determining the best person for laws, they handle laws, and then they have one vote. The best person that has to deal with technological capabilities, etc., we put that person at the top. We give them one vote. The best person when it comes to
best.
Okay, sorry? Thank you for that. Where on earth is meritocracy practice? Give us examples. 2, 3.
Every single organization in the world, to a large extent.
We are talking about states.
No, but again, what I'm saying is that we need to apply the principles of organizations to states.
Examples of states that do it.
They don't. That's my point. My point is that we need, because you asked me an alternative. I'm telling you, alternative is not something you're doing right now.
Part of the reason we're hanging out every Sunday to have a conversation, I believe, is to then help ourselves and our viewers think through some of these issues in a practical sense.
Yes.
So realistically now, how are we going to do this in your state,
what I'm saying is not so crazy.
Because we agree, I think there's broad agreement that, and again, speaking to Q-Best's comment, there's broad agreement that democracy is not working because it's not delivering, it's not delivering on competence for us. Road, school, security, blah, blah, blah. Now, you say, what's the alternative?
Okay.
Examples of where the alternative has worked and how it might work for us. Because we want people to leave this conversation thinking that there could be a path forward.
Okay.
It's okay if you don't think there is.
No, but there is. But it's that you're asking me 4 questions at the same time, and I'm going to break them down. But before we do that, we should go through the chat. So we've got QB Finance saying 100%. When will Nigeria have? That was to your comments there, Farouk. QB Finance put that in there. And then when will Nigeria have competent leaders? Again, that was through your comments as well, which I'll try to address. QB Finance also put laughing emoji. Yes, I'm laughing with you. We're all laughing together. Trust me on that one. I agree. There's no such thing as democracy in Africa. For instance, in Kenya, tribal leaders had political parties as kings. They can break a party, form a new one, and move with his entire sycophant. I agree with that as well.
Yusuf Ali, I think we already spoke to this point earlier.
We did, but
we need to take ownership of that definition of democracy.
Yeah,
we need.
Let me just go on. Let me just finish. Let me just go because there's still more appearing. So, okay, QB Finance as well said we need something different for sure. Shout out to that. And then it goes back to competence. And before you say anything, what you said or what you're asking me was, what are alternatives to do that? I was giving alternatives. You said, well, the alternatives don't exist in the real world. And it's like, well, democracy didn't exist in the real world before it existed. So you can create these systems and these processes in place by getting into positions of power and authority. If we're having these conversations and these conversations get to the point where other people who are in positions of power listen to us and we're having the conversations with them, or they hear the conversations and they begin to adapt it into their own expressions of reality and legislative control, then we can start moving that. So I'm not really looking
at these people you are hoping to build this meritocratic, these people you are hoping that will listen to us to build these meritocratic systems got there through democracy. So you're saying that democracy can lead to meritocracy?
No, it's what we have. It doesn't. So for example, no. So for example, it doesn't. No.
Doesn't want to even engage with the fact that it's possible. They say no.
I'm not saying it's not possible. What I'm saying is that you're making it seem like that's the only route to entry, and I'm saying it's not. So people, for example, people who own organizations very often, they come in there through systems that were not part of the organization's initial governance structure. It just wasn't. So people come into organizations and say, okay, I want to buy your company. And then the company had two founders or whatever. And they're like, well, going forward, we're going to have a board of directors. And they have a board of directors. And it changes the structure by somebody else coming into the existing structure, which was allowed by that structure. So what I'm saying is that we can change it from the inside by going through the existing roots of democracy, which doesn't work. I don't think democracy works. I think democracy is utterly shite. It's crap. It doesn't work. Getting people to vote for a thing that we don't test them to see whether they know what they're voting for, we don't check their ages, we don't check their involvement in those policies, is utterly stupid. It's a really stupid concept. I disagree with it entirely as an ideology.
How might you even test someone's competence to vote? What would that test?
Before they vote, you give them a test and say, you're voting for this election. These are the 15 key issues. Vote what you think these different parties stand for. Does party A stand for XYZ? Yes, no, yes, no. If they choose wrong on those things, they're disqualified from voting because they don't know what they're talking about.
People make more significant decisions for their lives without having to do that. People get married, they have children.
Okay, that's stupid and doesn't affect me. It affects them. That's
without needing to do any of this.
No, but it's true. I know what you're saying. But when you do those things, it's micro. You're doing things that affect your life. That's your business. If you go and marry the wrong person, that's your problem. If you go and do some dumb things and you go and start taking crack cocaine or whatever it is, I don't know if YouTube allows this one, but you go start doing some different kind of things, and that's your concern. But when you go and vote, it affects me, and not just me, it affects the wider society, which could affect my family, my children, my friends, my future options, etc. The implications are greater.
So just to make a comment about that, because I think we've touched on this earlier in talk. Democracy in principle. So when you go back to the definition of it, there's nothing about it that says that we have to have a vote every 4 years where the whole population go to vote. There's nothing about that. So if you're saying that in effect is a beef you have with democracy, there's no reason.
Then we can take it out.
I'm saying the whole thing is nonsense. I'm saying the idea that people should be it's not nonsense. The idea that someone should vote when I need to know who's voting and what they know when they're voting first. Second of all, tenure is an issue because tenure is on the other side. How long are people staying in these roles? If it's 4 years, they have an incentive to think about the next 4 years, which affects them. We should say it's indefinite. You're going to be in there until we vote you out, period. And then you're going to be there. And even then, we need to also change how that voting you out works.
So I think you're overlooking some practical problems. So if you have an indefinite tenure and you'll be there until we vote you out, then who calls the vote? There has to be a mechanism to say who's the right to call the vote. Right?
I was just trying to explain that.
Can they call the vote? You have to define that in law.
I was just trying to explain that. And obviously we can break it down into constituent parts or itty-bitty, details, etc. But I'll say things like, for example, you're in that role and you're in that position. You don't lose your tenure after 4 years based off of voting. You're stuck, you're in that role. We expect you to stay in that role indefinitely, unless you do not meet what it is that you set out. And we can put specific criteria on it. So if you said in the next 4 years, I am going to reduce crime by 42%, because we need to hold people to these things, these very smart objectives. 42%, you're going to reduce crime. We need to make sure that we're increasing, we're reducing inflation to 0.5%. All these kind of things. If you don't meet 75% of the goals that were very smart, very specific, measurable, articulable, relevant, timely, whatever it is that goes into smart. If you don't meet 75% of them, then we hold the general election. But the idea is about making sure that people are focusing on the goals and objectives based on what they've said, not based on what some arbitrary timeline.
So how much time? Again, when you say if you don't meet these objectives, then we'll call an election. You have to say if you don't meet them within a certain amount of time.
I agree, and it could be 4 years.
So again,
but let's at least put.
There's no getting away from time. There is no getting away from.
I agree. We can't escape time, but let's time bind these conversations rather than it being politicians come and say, "I'm going to reduce immigration. I'm going to do this." It's like, well, what are you saying? Give us your timeline to a thing, to a specific objective. And if you don't do it, then we deal with that at that point. But it's so that they're not feeling pressure. That they're only talking about.
So my own take on the way forward is I'm going to go back to one of the reasons we're having this conversation, Ibrahim Traoré. Africans are desperate for leadership. We're a young population. We feel we're tired of incompetent leaders. Okay, given we've been exposed to the world, we see other young people around the world, in China, in the West, living good lives with great infrastructure. We are desperate for a fix. But my warning to the audience and to all of us is that we should not fall for the trap of young men with guns shooting their way to power in the landscape of our failings and the clear failure of democracy, or so-called democracies, to deliver, and be waylaid by these young so-called revolutionaries. Mr. Traoré is probably the most popular African today. And I don't think all that is due to his own propaganda. A few people that are desperate for success, for the savior, for the messiah, have taken it upon themselves to propagate him. People that are frustrated at what they see are also propagating him. And he also probably has his own machine. Whereas, if by the stroke of luck, someone with good leadership skills, someone with a lot of patriotism, someone with a lot of vision and competence, whereas if they fell into power in that way, it would be a quick fix, because there we then employ other qualities that are completely separate from how they came into power. Competence. And then the fact that they are dictators and they can make quick decisions, they could deploy that and be potentially successful. Mr. Kagame in Rwanda is an example. He appears a competent man. I think that has less to do with the fact that he's a military dictator turned president than the system itself. Because we also have other military leaders that are messing up in Africa.
Yep.
So it's all down to competence, as Hubert said. So that's Traoré inspired this. Traoré and what's happening in Burkina Faso inspired our conversation today. And I think it's important to put that out there. We are desperate. We are failing. We're looking for answers. I don't think young men get into power with promises. It's the solution we need. I wish Traoré the best. I wish Burkina Faso the best. I hope Traoré becomes Al Maktoum or Al Saud or Lee Kuan Yew or the CCP. That's my wish for Africa, because I'm desperate for Africa to succeed. But stepping back from that, if you were to ask me what's the path forward, I would actually tell you it's local governance, democracy is the path forward. If you ask me what's the path forward for Nigeria today, what's the path forward for my village today, I will say it's for the young people there. It's for the village head there. It's for the policemen there. It's for the market women and farmers and hunters there to come together in the town hall and say, these are our problems. These are our priorities. This is how we are going to mobilize our joint aspirations, our joint legitimacy to get these herdsmen off our farm. We're going to work with the Nigerian police. We're going to work with our elected local government chairman. We're going to work with our chief. We're going to work with our hunters. We're going to set up cooperatives to loan ourselves money. We're going to have vigilantes. We're going to work with the Nigerian army. We're going to visit that brigade commander. It has to be local democracy. If you ask me practically what's the way forward, if I were back in my village today and I had a farm and my farm was invaded by the Fulani headsmen. And again, I'm not picking on Fulani because I've used that as an example so many times today. It's the most pressing issue: security, kidnappers, poor infrastructure. We have to get together, and when we get together that way, and we participate as market women, as teachers, as hunters, as citizens, then we are going to hold that level of our democracy to account. And this has nothing to do with one man, one vote. It has something to do with participation and holding to account. I think that's the way forward. I think there is a perverse incentive right now with the way things are in Nigeria to everybody look to the federal government, which is right. I think we need to focus a lot of attention on the local level. And I think the path forward is self-evolved local democracy. How it will work in my village and my state might be different from how it works in any state, how it works in crossing state. But the key thing is that it works. A good example of where this happens all across Nigeria is so-called estate associations. Developers build estate, different people from different walks of life move in there, and all of a sudden there is no governance. And then I belong to a few, and people get up, they form association, they form committees. We need people, insecurity, we employ security men. That's how my estate in Abuja is run. Being collection, we form committee.
But that's exactly what local governance means.
Yes, let's donate for bin collection. Let's donate for when our roads, when the erosion comes and drainage comes, we pull together our resources, our will, we vote and we implement it in the absence of governance. In a sense, we have evolved local democracy and we are governing ourselves within our estate. That is what we must do in villages, we must do in communities, we must do in local government, we must do in states, and we must do at the federal level. It doesn't necessarily translate to one vote. It doesn't translate. In fact, in my estate, the current ESCOs have been saying they want to go. We keep voting them in because they are doing a good job.
So again, that is you agreeing with Cross in your estate because that's what Cross
exactly. That's what's like. He's saying exactly what I'm saying.
That's also my point. That's also my point about the fact that governance has to be evolved. I don't subscribe to any definition imposed on me. And that's why I started off this conversation by saying we need to bastardize whatever we'll be given and adapt it to what works for me. If the current ESCO is doing well, why do I need to vote them out every 2 years?
Farouk is aligned.
They carry on the job.
That's my own now. Farouk is just aligned.
There's been some misalignment and there's been some alignment. Cross, take this up. So saying that there's now some alignment, which is quite helpful actually, because Farouk has described what I've got nothing to add there. That is local governance. This is how I think the whole world should be run from bottom up. And it seems that some of it even ties into your own idea of what you propose. So why don't you finish for us? Why don't you take that then and say, look forward. How do we turn that into something that works?
Okay. Just before I do that, we've got 2 more messages from QB Finest. So QB Finest question was, should political leaders be given 1-year contracts so that if they're not meeting the performance measures, we do not have to renew their contracts? We can vote someone else immediately. So this ties into kind of the conversation we were having earlier. And to tie back into Farouk's concept, I think focusing on the contract and the duration itself is not the issue. The issue is focusing on the specific goals, objectives, and deliverables that these political figures are required to give us. When we vote people in, currently, people vote things in. During the Brexit referendum, take back control. What was the metric for take back control? We didn't have anything. In Nigeria, there's multiple different, excuse me, there are multiple different mantras that we're giving for the different heads of state that recently did elections in Nigeria. And it's like, well, what exactly is the metric to measure and determine whether or not you've performed on XYZ specific goal? If you say take back control, let's use that as an example. What does that mean? Does that mean that we're changing these 15% of the laws of the UK within the next 2 years? I'm going to hold you to that. this is the thing. Politics and democracy. So I agree with you, Farouk, generally on the idea that democracy itself is not the issue, it's the implementation, and we need to bastardize it to turn it into what we need to. But I don't agree with that at the same time, because I think there's the issue of, it's a different thing. Once we start talking about what I'm talking about here, about holding politics to a very clearly objective standard, where when you say I'm going to do a thing, when you're running for office, we measure you against that thing objectively. It changes what democracy is right now. Democracy right now is voting based on your feelings. I'm saying we move from those feelings to a system that is based on an objective standard. That's it.
To be finest, I personally feel that the idea of a 1-year contract is not practicable. If you even want to run a business, a small business, at the end of the first 12 months, you probably don't even have I mean, it's too short a time. I also don't have a view on what's the right time. I think these are questions for societies and countries to work out and decide. As long as there's a mechanism for feedback, for correction, that's what matters. And I think human systems are complex and they work in interesting ways. So the idea that there's an election every 4 years is not necessarily a bad one. It's a way of going back for some sort of feedback. If that party or that group has done well, even if the leader goes, then the party or that group can remain in power and continue to implement its vision. The CCP in China has ruled China since 1949. In that time, they've experimented several things and several people have led. It's still the same party. So would you say the Chinese change every 5 or 10 years before they changed it? Or would you say they have a system that is robust, where the same party with the same politburo, with the same processes have remained in power? So different societies have evolved different means of reappraising performance, of saying, look, this is enough time for us to check and see whether you are doing well. And then to give that sort of feedback. In traditional African settings, it's not the whole population they go back to. They go to village heads or family heads who have meetings and decide that we're not happy with the chief. That is democracy. In traditional Afghan societies, they have the royal jiga or something like that, where clans and tribes have different heads who then meet at various levels to then feed back to the politburo that this is our feeling. Same with the CCP in China. They have local level democracy where there's source feedback and there's local governance. So I think all these are iterations of democracy. And let's not be taken apart that with the illusion of choice they give us with the Western one we all tend to understand. Ultimately, the choices are distilled for us in one way or the other. And decision making is also, once a decision has been made, someone is in power, even in the so-called democracy. For the next 4 years, they are tyrants, essentially. They do what they want to do. And they'll come back to you and say, like Trump is saying now, I have the mandate, you gave me the mandate. So there is no ideal there. These are human systems, they're imperfect, they're evolving. Let's keep adapting. But the way forward is more democracy, local democracy. I think that would be the last word from me today. Thank you.
Nathan, thanks everyone for joining us. I think we can go on and on, but we have to be mindful of the time. I think I'll just let Cross just kind of close us with his final thoughts, a couple of minutes. But I think it's been a fascinating discussion. It was good to see the misalignment and alignment and realignment, whatever you want to call it. But I think we're all really thinking about this, and what is clear is that there's no simple answers. I think we'll all agree with that. Cross, if you just kind of give us and maybe also have a summary of how you see everything.
Yeah. So for me, the biggest thing is it's that we've applied models of a very performance-based system across the world, and we call these things organizations. We've got Apple, we've got Amazon, well, multiple different big named organizations that work off of the concept of KPIs, OKRs, performance metrics. What are you going to do this year? Have you done it? Yes, no, no, out. Yes, stay. Yes, carry on to the next step. We are looking at countries for some reason as a slightly different system or as a slightly different entity when we shouldn't. We need to look at countries as what they are, a collection of people who are trying to achieve an objective, which is generally to survive, but generally as well to improve the standard of living that we have. With those objectives in mind, we should focus on getting people in there who we can hold to very clear metrics of success. If you're coming in and your focus is on, I am going to reduce immigration, I'm reducing immigration by 15%. If that is your objective and people vote you in on that, we're going to hold you to it. If you're coming in and your things, we're going to increase immigration by 25% because we believe that we need to have more people here providing labor, etc. Well, 25% is what we're expecting to get from you within the next 2 years. And we have metrics that are clear. Currently, we have systems in place where we vote based on feelings, to the point where we have individuals that are voting that know nothing about it. 18-year-olds have no place voting. Why is an 18-year-old voting? They don't know anything. They don't know the policies. They don't know their own lives. They don't know the things that are going to affect them in the future. They understand nothing about taxes. They know nothing. But we're allowing them to vote. I'm not saying they shouldn't necessarily vote. But what I'm saying is we need to create a system that follows systems that exist, to your point, Farouk.
And 18-year-olds might feel that it's unfair to be racist to black people. And they might feel that way, and that's their feeling. And on that particular point, I agree with them and I appreciate their votes. I don't see any reason why. I don't have any issue with the 16-year-old even voting.
12-year-olds might think that I should be able to eat bread. Okay, I don't care what a 12-year-old thinks to that degree, especially when it comes to deciding what the laws are going to be. It just isn't relevant. And I don't think 18-year-olds have sufficient experience of the world to be able to set deterministic systems in place for what happens in everybody else's lives. They just don't. So I get them. I have some opinions that are valid or opinions that match against my opinions and make my own opinion sound great. But it doesn't change the fact that they don't have enough lived experience to be able to validate whatever it is that they're saying, which is my point. They just don't have that. And I think we need to move to a system where it's the people who have a stake that are able to hold, those in power to a very objective standard of success, whether through OKRs, whether through other kinds of systematic processes, that we look at things and say, did you do what you said you're going to do? We don't have that currently in democracy. And that's why I think democracy doesn't work. That's my final thoughts on this.
On that very passionate sort of almost an appeal, I would say thanks everyone for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have. Farouk, Cross, QB, Finest, Yusuf, and everyone else contributing and those listening quietly. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back again next week with another fascinating topic. Please join us again, same time, same station. Signing out.
Thank you.